Welcome everybody to a very special edition. We're doing this for all sorts of media outlets: the Florida Squeeze, the Florida News Signal, Leon County Democrats. We're doing this for Tropical Depression also. Ryan Ray joins me. Want to thank Max Herrle for producing what is going to be a very special discussion of the late Governor Buddy MacKay, who just passed away this week at the age of 91. And someone I had a lot of personal experience with. We did a show like this, Ryan, about Bob Graham, who I followed and I knew, but didn't know and wasn't kind of in the circle the way I was with Governor MacKay. So very great man. I think we're talking about someone who had such an impact on this state.
Yeah, and this comes at a time where the nation is mourning, and especially particularly Democrats are mourning the passing on of Jimmy Carter at the age of 100. So it's a time of general mourning. But for you, like you've said, your relationship with Buddy MacKay took on a more of a personal valence than your memory of some of these others. Tell us what Buddy MacKay meant to you in your life, Kartik.
Well, I think he was, to me, the Florida Democrat, right? He was the um, most pioneering Florida Democrat who came from an area which was electing Republicans already by the late 1980s in Ocala, that was able to thread the needle, if that's the term we want to use, between the progressive wing of the party, which included people like you and me, Ryan, and the more traditional kind of Chamber of Commerce wing of the party, which included most of the establishment of Florida Democrats at the time, uh, and not quite the kind of conservative Democrats, the insurance type Democrats who we're going to get to the '98 campaign at some point, and that's why um, they would say things like, "Hey, buddy, you're liberal," right? But he was very much, I think, the glue, the figure that had the trust of us progressives, the figure that was the genuine liberal, right? The genuine article in Democratic Party circles. He's a guy who had the bona fides, who had challenged and taken on Dempsey Barron in the state senate as one of the leaders of the Doghouse Democrats with Bob Graham. Um, I so admire Bob Graham as you do, Ryan, but I think it was a little easier for Bob Graham to take on Dempsey Barron being from Miami than it was for Buddy MacKay being from Ocala. So um, just a premier environmentalist. To me, he was what a Florida Democrat was, and a party that we no longer have. The Buddy MacKay style Democrat doesn't exist anymore, and hence we've lost control of the state.
Well, a little bit, much has been said. I think much has been made of the great tradition of, maybe going back to Pepper, but certainly everyone would pick up Collins. You would pick up Askew, Graham. I think, Childs is in there for some folks on a case by case basis. But, Buddy MacKay, wasn't he sort of the thought leader in many ways? Wasn't he something that almost was the shadow of Childs, that the angel that kind of guided the entire enterprise in a more public interest direction?
Yes, and in fact, I think that this is an important point to stress that I have the greatest respect for Lawton Childs. I admire Lawton Childs, but I think for the liberal wing of the party, or what we now call the progressive wing, now I guess we liberal has a different meaning now, but for what was the liberal wing of the party, Childs's credibility came from MacKay when he was governor, right? The credibility, the belief that Lawton was with us was because Buddy MacKay was not his lieutenant governor in a traditional lieutenant governor sense. He was effectively a co-governor in many ways. We've never seen a lieutenant governor like this. Maybe Bush kind of emulated it with Brogan before he took the presidency at FAU at Florida Atlantic, but we haven't seen it since, right? Since we've had kind of just throwaway lieutenant governors, Jeff Kottkamp, Jennifer Carroll. I can't even remember her name now, Jeanette Nunez. Right? They're not
Who could
serious
forget Carlos
policy
Lopez
makers.
Cantera?
Right, exactly. Whereas Buddy was kind of the co-governor. Buddy MacKay was the guy that in 1988, just 2 years before that 1990 governor's race that we're going to talk so much about, and we're seeing some slides from that campaign that Max has put together for us, and from other events in Buddy MacKay's public life. Buddy MacKay won the Democratic primary for U.S. Senate in an upset. Bill Gunter, the sitting insurance commissioner, was the favorite of the Tallahassee money crowd, was the favorite of the insurance industry. Dan Mica, who was a sitting congressman, pretty conservative congressman, colleague of Buddy MacKay, who was a congressman at the time also, was the favorite of, I would say, the polluters and the heavy industry. And Buddy MacKay was the favorite of the liberals, of the environmentalists, of the progressives, of people like Eric Draper, of the public interest wing, the Karen Woodalls and Barbara Devanes of the party. And he won the nomination, right? He finished second in the primary. He wins the runoff, and he was so close to being a U.S. senator. So close. We'll get into that race, I'm sure, tonight. But he was, Ryan, just to make this kind of simple, he was kind of the liberals' liberal in that era of Florida. He was a guy that he was with the child advocates. He was with the environmentalists. He was with the very concerned about issues that were affecting senior health. And you could look at his voting record in Congress and say, oh, well, if you're a progressive today, and say, oh, maybe he was more conservative than I would have liked. But in that era, that was absolutely the most liberal figure you could get running statewide in Florida and potentially winning. Actually, in any era, right? And he should have won that Senate race.
There's a little bit of a only Nixon could go to China element with him, right? Wasn't he like a necessary sort of yin to the South Florida urban core centric yang of his longtime partner? And it's hard to overstate the degree of collaboration. Like you said, Childs and MacKay governed like, but also campaigned like this tag team, right? You get this team. It's funny, Jeb up here in Tallahassee, you'll see some the ad with Jeb on a dual tandem bicycle with Frank Brogan, and that was unusual, and I think that was no question influenced by the relationship between Childs MacKay, that sort of double branding, top of the ticket, bottom of the ticket kind of a thing. You don't see that much in gubernatorial campaigns. They very much worked that way and kind of had a pick and roll relationship where they're very closely related to one another. And this is an unusual relationship that was not just in that administration, but they had honed in years working together to bring money to Florida when Lawton Childs was one of the highest ranking U.S. senators for years and was very respected and very accomplished legislator. And Buddy MacKay was his House, basically essentially deputy, his emissary, in the House budget process in Congress together. So the political partnership between MacKay and Childs is almost without parallel in Florida's political history.
Yeah, Childs was the chairman of the budget committee. He had been the ranking member when the Democrats were in the minority. They regained the majority in '86. Were in the majority in the House the whole time. So MacKay had a seat, or kind of a ranking seat, or a high-ranking seat in the majority party. Mm-hmm. On that side of the Capitol in Washington, and Childs becomes the budget chair. And there was speculation in 1990 or in 1989 that Buddy MacKay, who had lost, we should talk about '88 first.
Yeah, the '88 Senate campaign, because that's really vitally important to everybody's estimation of MacKay and his ultimate significance.
Yeah, so '88. I mentioned he was the liberal running. You had two more conservative candidates of the kind of serious candidates, and MacKay ends up winning in a runoff. We don't have runoffs anymore. So if it were happening now, Bill Gunter would have been the nominee. Basically, what it was is that in a runoff, which was really about organizing, all the energy was on the progressive side, and it was a lower turnout one-off. There was one thing on the ballot that runoff day in 1988. MacKay-Gunter straight U.S. Senate among Democrats, and MacKay won. So he got into the runoff, he got into the general, and Michael Dukakis was a drag on the Democratic ticket. Dukakis would lose Florida by 22 points. MacKay, it appeared election night, had won. And in fact, Connie Mack called and conceded him. I've just come back from Fort Myers, actually. I was at the Edison Ford Museum today, which I did not realize had a Connie Mack wing,
Oh
which I guess
wow.
has been added. And it's about baseball, right? It's about the Mack family, but it was created by Connie Mack III, right? Who beat McKay that night. Couple things that happened in that election. First off, Broward County, the placement of, and at the time, Broward County had the Republican supervisor of elections, but was like it is now, the Democratic county. The placement of the McKay Mack race on the ballot um, has been explained to me because I wasn't a voter yet in '88, although I do remember the race, was in a position where a lot of voters skipped it. So you had Dukakis Bush presidential race, and then you had the next thing was the congressional race in your district. The Senate race was over here, kind of a butterfly ballot like
So you
situation.
had a significant undervote that was
Yes,
to the detriment of McKay.
at least 10,000 Democratic votes were probably lost based on that. And then you had military ballots that came in after the fact um, that gave Mack the margin. That days, or actually it was 2 weeks later, we found out Mack had won. The military ballot thing is always stuck in my mind because in 2000, when I was going through the recount in Palm Beach County, I and our lawyers decided we're going to try and knock out these military ballots because we know what happened. Those of us who were from Florida knew what happened in 1988 to Buddy MacKay. Unfortunately, the DC lawyers were also there, and the DC lawyers didn't want the impression of looking like they were anti-military or non-patriotic. So they said, no, you guys can't challenge those. We tried to explain to them we had lost the U.S. Senate race in Florida based on basically those ballots coming in, no one really observing them, and Connie Mack becoming a U.S. senator. And during that campaign, in campaigning for Buddy MacKay, Bob Graham had called Connie Mack an intellectual midget. And so then he had to work with Mack after, and they had a good working relationship. But that was the estimation of Mack going up against this titan, which was Buddy MacKay, who had been Graham's partner in crime, stopping the pork chop gang and Dempsey Barron in the state Senate, and then had been very much an ally of Graham, who was the governor when Graham was the governor, and MacKay was in the U.S. House, an ally of Graham, and then as we mentioned, Childs was in the U.S. Senate. Incredible. We're talking about Democrats who had relationships going back to the state Senate, to the state House, or even in some cases to the University of Florida, or in the case of people who were around Reuben Askew to Florida State University, people having grown up together, then being the most important decision makers in Florida and maintaining a relationship with one another where the thing that mattered most was how could they help Florida. It wasn't, hey, how can I advance my career? How can I become president? How can I become the Democratic nominee for president? It was, we're doing something good for the state. We're trying to make sure Florida continues to be a shining city on the hill. So Graham, Childs, MacKay, they're your key figures with that as we get into the 90s. And then Ryan, we got to 1990, and Bill Nelson was the presumptive Democratic nominee, Congressman Bill Nelson, for governor, and he was faltering. And every Democrat in the state agreed we had to get rid of Bob Martinez. And Lawton Childs did not really want to come back into public office. But what happened was Buddy MacKay convinced Childs, if you run and you run with me, it'll basically be a co-governorship. And in fact, this is where my relationship with them starts. And in fact, it was kind of ironic because my dad worked for NASA. He knew Bill Nelson very well. He didn't know Childs or MacKay as well. But for some event in West Palm Beach, my dad had to pick up Childs from the airport in April of 1990 or March of 1990, and he told my father in the car. I think Doug Cook was with him. It was Doug Cook, and my dad knew Doug Cook well, so it was Doug Cook and Lawton Childs. And Doug Cook, I think, had been his chief of staff in the U.S. Senate. And basically said, I'm going to run with Buddy MacKay for governor. And then 2 weeks later or a week later, it became official. And so that 1990 campaign was unbelievable. George Stewart, who was the presumptive kind of liberal challenging Nelson from the left in the Democratic Party. He was a state senator from Orlando. He got out of the race, endorsed Charles and McKay, and I believe Max has teed up for us some of the ads from that 1990 campaign.
There's a new spirit of change and hope sweeping across Florida, a revolution in politics that's taking on the big money special interests, fighting for the people. Walken, Lawton Childs, and Buddy MacKay, honest, trusted, proven leaders, not beholden to the big money boys. Finally, a team that can really control growth, protect our environment, and improve our quality of life. The big developers and the SNL special interests have their candidates, but thank goodness the people have Childs MacKay. Join the fight for positive change. Childs MacKay. This time the people.
This time the people win. Explicit appeals against the big money boys. Pretty interesting in light of today's dynamics, isn't it?
Very, very, very interesting, and it's the sort of messaging you don't hear from Democrats anymore. And I remember the 1990 campaign differently than I remember 94. By 94, I was in college. I was in the University of Florida College Democrats. I was recruited onto helping the campaign in Alachua County. 1990, though, I remember my parents, who hadn't really been that involved in campaigns per se, bundling money basically from individuals, $100 checks. They wouldn't take more than $100. It was so refreshing. So it was basically all your friends, all your associates write $100 checks, and no special interest money, no PAC money for Charles MacKay. This is why it's very difficult in modern terms sometimes to explain to people who don't know that era. There will be progressives that you and I come across every day, Ryan, who say, oh, well, Lawton Childs was like a neoliberal. Lawton Childs was like a conservative Democrat. Be like, to me, he was very progressive. He didn't take special interest money. Buddy MacKay didn't take special interest money. Nowadays, every Democrat takes big money, right? For most federal offices or statewide offices. So 90 was very interesting. And my mother told me a story today and sent me the clip from it too, where she met Buddy MacKay. She was in Tallahassee for the PTA legislative conference. She met Buddy MacKay in front of the Hilton, which is now the DoubleTree, right? On Adams Street, and that brought MacKay to that PTA legislative conference that the two of them went to, Childs and MacKay. And my mother ended up becoming kind of a go-to person for the administration. We would always talk about, I would say to people, hey, my mother is very involved, is very in with the Childs administration, right? She got appointed to the governor's commission on accountability. She got appointed, I think she was the only parent representative on the governor's Blue Ribbon Commission on Education. She got appointed to a couple of other things by Childs. I'll confess to you tonight, all these years later, it was a relationship with Buddy MacKay. Lawton Childs knew who my mother was, but she didn't have the sort of personal relationship. He wasn't, the Governor Childs wasn't talking to my mother on the phone. Lieutenant Governor MacKay was. Governor Childs would not have appointed my mother to any of those positions if Buddy MacKay hadn't said, hey, Latha Krishnaiyer is the person you want in this position when it came to education and being the parent rep. So I was just thinking about that today because I was in Fort Myers, and I remember my senior year in high school making a trip with my mother for one of the accountability, that was 1992, one of the accountability commission meetings, which my mother had been appointed to by the governor, or maybe that particular appointment may have come from Betty Castor, the Commissioner of Education, but it was MacKay related. So yeah, and then there was so much that went into holding the line, Ryan, and this is something that I'd love your take on. 1992, we get not a Republican majority in the Senate, but it was 2020. And at that point, Charles MacKay agenda of cutting government red tape, improving education, weeding out the special interests, really cleaning up the Everglades, which was something the Martinez administration wasn't willing to do. All of that came into jeopardy. And after 96, we had a Republican House as well. 92, 2020 Senate, 94, the Senate flips formally. 96, we get a Republican House. And so much of what Childs and McKay wanted to do in 2 terms of office, they weren't able to do after their second year, after the losses in the legislature, which is why McKay's 98 campaign very much felt like um, we're running on unfulfilled, on the things that we weren't able to do, the things we need to do, and we were going to do, but we weren't able to do because of these darn legislators.
Yeah, the unfortunate unfinished business, which is such a term so heavily loaded with the Charles McKay era, of course. I mean, um, Buddy MacKay becoming the governor in the most sad and tragic way, with so much left to do for both of them. It would have been amazing to see that vision realized. There were a great deal of maybe we can queue up. I think it brings to mind the issue of defectors, right? And people crossing.
I wanted to talk about that tonight.
People crossing. In my view, when I was kind of learning the ropes about state government politics, so the high water, one of the last really meaningfully big time, heavyweight battle, that head to head at a statewide office that the Democrats won, was Charles McKay beating Jeb in '94. We know that '94, of course, was the Gingrich Contract with America year, one of the most Republican landslide years ever, bar none. And people like Childs were swept out of office across the country. Here, the Democrats held. Charles McKay was reelected. The old Hukun did indeed rise just before the light of day and hold off, the Jeb Bush, the son of a president, the brother of a future president. I mean, the behemoth figure in Florida politics, beaten in 1994 by a pair of old-style liberal Democrats, you could say, and Charles and McKay. It was pretty amazing. But we see in this day of defections, we've got the Cassell out with Rep. Hillary Cassell and Susan Valdez switching parties. My political education was defined in a lot of ways. I learned about these dynamics by way of some of the people who were part of that coalition that bailed on Buddy in '98. You had legislators who had one foot on either side. You had folks defecting, and I wonder.
You had a cabinet officer. You had Bob Crawford endorse Jeb Bush, who was a Democratic statewide elected official. He was ag commissioner, and I remember the NAACP putting out, or their PAC putting out cards that palm cards after that skipped the ag commissioner race for that reason. Said, agricultural commissioner, no recommendation, because core liberals felt really burnt. But yeah, TK Weatherall, future president of Florida State, who had been Speaker of the House, whose wife had served in the Childs administration. We had a state senator from South Florida, Ron Silver, endorse Jeb Bush. We had a future House Democratic leader, Chris Smith, state House member, endorse Jeb Bush. It was awful. It was awful. And the run up to '98, Ryan, had been really painful because I didn't know all these dynamics. I was very young. I had just gotten out of school. And I went to the Democratic Convention in Tampa. It was, I think it's the last time they held it at the Convention Center in Tampa, right? It's been permanently in Orlando, at Disney since, or in Orlando since. And I discovered there were all of these elected officials that I knew of. I didn't actually know them at that time. I would get to know most of them, but that were actively saying Buddy MacKay is too liberal. We need someone stronger to run against Jeb Bush. We need Bill Nelson, who was the insurance commissioner. We need Bob Butterworth, or we need to get behind this guy, Rick Dantzler, who was running, who was a state senator from Polk County. And I was shocked. I mean, that was really my education, Ryan, was that convention. I couldn't believe it. Now, maybe I was naive. I was an idealist. I thought, we're all Charles McKay people. I mean, well, who would go against Buddy in the Democratic Party? But as it turns out, the money people were against Buddy MacKay.
We see, and we're going to have for our listeners and viewers treat them to an ad about a defection. This also, of course, following the era in the '90s of Barney Bishop, who is, of course, now a right-wing police lobbyist and someone who's still.
I think the Barney thing started in '98. He endorsed Jeb that year, and that's when the whole thing started with him.
So, with all those flip floppers in mind, let's check out this ad from Concerned Conservatives for Charles.
Folks, I'm Tommy Thomas, former chairman of the state Republican Party and President Ronald Reagan's three-time state chairman. 4 years ago, I made a big mistake. I served as Bob Martinez's state co-chairman. He misled me and the entire state. He said he was a conservative and could cut $800 million worth of waste out of the state budget. He forgot that promise and pushed for the biggest tax boondoggle in this state's history. You know it had to be repealed. Now he says, excuse me, I won't let it happen again. I trust Senator Childs, and you can too.
So, a Democratic campaign putting TV money behind the former RPOF chairman, defector, former chair of Bob Martinez, who himself was a party chair. What do you make of that?
Yeah, and that was kind of the era. Yeah, that was kind of the era where there were Republicans who liked Lawton Childs, because I'll never forget University of Florida. There was this guy during the '96 campaign when I was the college Democrats president, who was the son of a prominent Republican, and I was going out with him that night, and I let him come into Democratic headquarters at Butler Plaza, and everyone knew who he was and complained, why is this guy here? And he admitted, yeah, I'm for Bob Dole. But he said, I voted for Lawton Childs against Jeb Bush, and and I would vote for Lawton Childs again. It turns out Lawton Childs never ran again. Obviously, we're going to get to him tragically passing away. But there were Republicans like that. So then no one minded that I brought this kid into the Alachua County Democratic Party headquarters, because he was the son of a prominent Republican in Orange County, and he had voted for Lawton Childs. He admitted it, that I voted for Lawton Childs against Jeb Bush. He said that very, very matter of factly. And I think it was a different time also, because you had Republicans in the state that I think understood that Florida was a unique and special place. They had come of political age when Reuben Askew was the governor. Sure, they had tried to get a conservative to replace him, right? Jerry Thomas was their candidate. A lot of them, if they had been Democrats at the time, were supporting Ben Hill Griffin Jr. in his, speaking of the University of Florida, in his quixotic run from the right against Askew in that primary. But there was an understanding that Florida was a unique place. It was a special place. There was a special brand of Florida Democrat that looked out for the state's interest, was interested in environmental issues and growth management, was interested in job creation and entrepreneurship. But that meant bringing the film industry to Florida in a big way, which Askew and Graham did, and Childs continued, and bringing tech companies to Florida. All the tech companies now are in California or Texas, right? They're not in Florida. But during the Graham years and the Childs years, there was a real effort to bring tech companies to Florida. The personal computer was invented in Boca Raton by a UF graduate, Don Estridge, a Graham Democrat, basically. But that all changed after '98, and then you began getting these partisan Republicans. So there was some sort of flip there, because there were a lot of Republicans, Ryan, and you probably have heard these stories around Tampa, around Hillsborough County from your family. There were a lot of kind of Jack Eckerd Republicans. Is that what St. Pete Times Republicans is what you would call them? And they would vote for a lot of the kind of Democrats that we're talking about, that we have such sentiment for.
The old Charlie Crist, era, like back, really a better vintage of it.
Yeah, right. Which is why a guy like Crist ended up as a Democrat eventually, even though I think the last thing publicly Buddy MacKay did, I mean, we're fast forwarding here, but he endorsed Nan Rich in that primary in 2014, which also reinforces, Ryan, Buddy's instincts were to the left, right? And so in the '98 campaign, I guess I should mention this. My first actual staff job on a political campaign was being a staffer on that campaign, an unpaid staffer. I mean, we were cash for the campaign, but that included at times driving MacKay around. Infamously, when I got lost one day in Palm Beach County, driving him up from North Miami to West Palm. We didn't have GPSs back then, and there were two roads with the same name, one in Lake Worth, one in West Palm. And I went to the one in Lake Worth. And years later, some Childs veteran was telling that story in Andrews. Was it in Andrews or in Clyde's in Tallahassee? And I happened to be there. I said, "Wait a second, I am the guy who got Buddy MacKay lost. I'm the guy you're talking about." I went to the road in Lake Worth and not the one in West Palm. But in that campaign, Ryan, I learned what a compassionate and truly, if lefties want something to cling on to, how instinctively left he was. Basically, his concern was about the poor people. His concern was about the seniors who may not have health insurance. His concern was about making sure pre-K and early childhood readiness was a priority of state government. He was very much committed to fighting school vouchers. He was pro-choice, which was very difficult to be as openly pro-choice as he was. Even when he was in Congress, he was openly pro-choice from Ocala. Just an unbelievable man. And unfortunately, he went down to defeat in 98. But Ryan, as you're, I think, going to tell us the story, he ends up as governor anyway.
Well, of course, we think about the counterfactual, some of the one short-lived Democratic governor that came to the power was Wayne Mixon, who was kind of didn't really offer a lot. Was not exactly the conscience
he
of
may
the
have
Graham
backed Bush
Nixon
in 98.
administration.
He probably backed Bush in 98. Wayne Mixon.
Totally.
He ended his life backing Republicans. I know that.
Yes. He made his pledge in the Barney Bishop suite at the Governor's Club, and of course. An interesting counterfactual. We all know Giles, of course, died in office. The so-called fitness question was raised in the 90 campaign. Nelson played on it to a degree. Yeah. Claude Kirk, who was running his own, you might say, quixotic primary campaign against Bob Martinez, played on it in 1990. There's a world where, when Buddy MacKay made that 1988 U.S. Senate campaign, what we talked about, which could have significantly changed the shape of our state's politics, and who knows how many ways downstream counterfactuals we get, right? Because we're looking at totally different tickets in 90 and 94. But when he made that 88 run, which he lost by less than 1%, some people said that he got a raw deal, a great deal of journalism and speculation, and lots of evidence to suggest that very many worlds where MacKay wins. Of course, he does not. But when he made that 88 run, he was already in exploratory phases of a 1990 governor's run. And Nelson was already in it. He felt very good. Buddy said, okay, he's going to get in there. He was polling well. I think that in 88 there were polls that were telling him that he would win in 90 in a Democratic primary and in a general election. So the 88 campaign really got Giles, really made it so that perhaps it's easy to see a world where Giles does not die in office in 98 because he's not the governor. He's supporting a Buddy MacKay administration. Who knows where that leaves things in 98. But yes, the special relationship between Giles and MacKay, of course, ends in one ceding the governor's office to another by way of his death. Lawton Giles dies in the governor's mansion, 1998, which is a one-in-a-kind experience that I think that many in Florida politics up here and around the state are still reeling from, and that really was one of the last acts, one of the last dramas, one of the last major events of Democratic control in Florida state government.
Yeah, it was, and it was under such tragic circumstances. But Buddy MacKay was always meant to be governor of the state, and in fact, there was talk when it looked like MacKay was having trouble in the primary and people wanted someone else in 98 of a swap where MacKay would, Bob Graham would resign from the Senate. Giles would appoint MacKay to that seat, and Graham would try and take out Jeb Bush because this is for another show, but I'll just mention really briefly that Bob Graham already by 1998 and definitely by 2001 had determined that Jeb Bush was going to be very bad for the state and for education in the state, and was concerned that maybe he needed to be the guy to stop Bush because he had the gravitas to do it. MacKay didn't. Wanted to mention our mutual friend Bobby Bucciolato, who of course co-hosts the Florida History Podcast with me. Max Herrle and I have both written forwards and afterwards for his books. His grandfather, Walter C. Young, was a Democratic legislator from Broward County, and Buddy MacKay talks about it in his autobiography, How Florida Happened, which I think both you and I have with us today. Yeah, you have your copy as well.
Happened.
Yep.
Shout out to University Press, Florida, Buddy MacKay's book, his account of his political education in the state of Florida. I mean, as literally making Florida happen.
Yeah, and he gives Bobby's grandfather, a lot of credit in this book for actually educating him about what he called vertical counties. So that's another legacy of the Charles MacKay era. The condo commandos in Broward County, in particular, Palm Beach and Miami-Dade to a lesser extent, they were at their height. And Broward County in particular became like urban New York or urban Chicago for Democratic candidates, which was part of, and Republicans would cry foul because basically you would see these heavily Jewish senior precincts in Broward County come in with 97% for Childs and 90% turnout, right? But Buddy MacKay talks about it in his book that he learned about that from Robert's grandfather, and the book is wonderful. It's all about kind of the political education and how Florida happened, literally, because the 1970s and 1980s, and then the first half of the 1990s were when Florida was at its peak, right? This is when Florida was more progressive than California. We were kind of the envy of the entire region, the southern region of the United States. Mm-hmm. Jobs were coming here. Movies were being made here. Culture and arts was thriving here. And tech companies were being launched here. And so much of that was down to the kind of this is why I have a hard time with ideology now, and people saying, well, Childs was really a conservative Democrat or MacKay was really a conservative Democrat. There was how would you describe it, Ryan? You might be better at describing it than me. There was a culture, there was a feel that made Florida a very progressive place. A tone set by these elected officials.
There is an openness to outsiders that I think now is harvested by the right. That basically just a lack of transience, a lack of local ties, and the sort of communal bonds that make that make a progressive local culture. But I think at the time there was a willingness to take on. You hear the big money old boys, the big money special interests, the establishment that Childs and MacKay really made their target successfully for two major statewide victories. That I think that in a way, even though someone who like Bob Graham, who was a bit of a class trader, you could argue, was someone who looked after working class interests despite aristocratic origins. That I think is something that today's moribund Democratic politics could use a little bit more of.
Ryan, I want you to comment on what we're looking at on our screen for those of you watching us. This is about the Cross Florida Barge Canal, which is one of the things that got Buddy MacKay into running for office. And he had always been a liberal. By the way, he was someone who supported civil rights and integrating his church in Ocala in the early 1960s. Very courageous stand of Ann and Buddy MacKay. Ann was his wife. You know a lot about this Cross Florida Barge Canal controversy, which stimulated Buddy MacKay's career. Tell us a little bit about it. Very local issue in Ocala, by the way.
Well, yeah, the Cross Florida Barge Canal incident is something that launched many political careers, and frankly, it was just one of the biggest infrastructure projects. When people talk about a boondoggle, the Big Dig in Boston, or other major, huge infrastructure projects driven by Army Corps of Engineers and driven by but sort of trying to play God and natural features. This is one of the greatest examples of all time. And I mean, one thing that kills me still thinking about how in Buddy MacKay's career really getting launched, stopping Florida from being cut in half for commercial shipping
literally.
Literally. And now I think it is the site of the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, Marjorie Kenneth Rawlings,
Not Marjorie Harris Carr. It's funny,
Marjorie Harris
all of these
Carr,
Marjories from Florida, right?
the Marjorie Harris Carr part of me, Greenway across Florida, which is probably the most poetic way that you could have ended this basically humanitarian catastrophe that was really close to being done. The thing that still gets me is how many millions of dollars were spent on that project that was later deauthorized infamously.
Yeah, and last thing we'll get we'll let everybody go in a minute, but this week, as you mentioned, President Carter passed away as well. These two titans back to back, and Michael Grunwald, who was the author of The Swamp, a political writer based in Miami, he talked about the most amazing thing about Carter. He had this long thread on Twitter, was that he was the first president to understand, because he was an engineer, right? He understood the Army Corps of Engineers taking on projects like the Cross Florida Barge Canal and all the channelization and canalization of the Kissimmee River and the Caloosahatchee River, all these things they did in the state of Florida, how damaging and dangerous it was. And I think it kind of ties a bow on this, because Buddy MacKay was probably the first prominent elected official in Florida, along with Jim Williams, his friend from Ocala, that understood this firsthand because of what they saw begin in their area. Should mention Nat Reed, who was a prominent Republican, who I think ended his life backing Democrats exclusively. But Nat Reed was another one who he's the person who got to Richard Nixon and said, he was a Republican from Martin County. Stop this cross Florida barge canal. But these were two similar elected officials, right? Carter and MacKay, I think, were very similar in their liberalism and in their tolerance and in their big picture vision and their compassion. I mean, two people I think that were giants in this region and in this country.
No question about it. What do you think is the best way? We talk about the golden era, the golden age of Florida politics. Certainly he was someone who cut his teeth in that world and wanted to make he did make a huge contribution. Buddy MacKay, so marked by being sort of on the cusp of something greater, right? He was an integral part, but it's almost hard to not define him or see him in light of a lack, right? Because he played that second fiddle role, or really a co-governor role with Childs, and he was frustrated with Childs at times. He wanted Childs to, for instance, on the choice issue, on the abortion issue.
Yeah.
That was one where you had moral majority, Michael Dobson. You had these kind of folks working on Childs to maintain something like a nuance or a states' rights kind of an issue, or it's up to the local school boards kind of a issue, a point of view. MacKay was always clear about what you should say. Hey, Lawton, here's what you should say. I'm pro-choice. That's what he wanted. Childs was never really willing to go there on it. Even his famous, one of my favorite things, one of the last acts of the Childs administration was the Choose Life license plate issue. This is very classic Childs era thing, where the Republicans in the legislature, who were then burgeoning, would gone from nearly a majority to majorities in both houses during the course of the Childs MacKay administration. They wanted to create a license plate. Childs vetoed it, did not allow the creation of a Choose Life, state-sanctioned pro-life, in his view, messaging. But he said that's because a license plate was not the proper venue, right? He stopped short of a thoroughgoing opposition to the policy in general. Tell us a bit about your understanding of that interplay between the MacKay and Childs partnership.
Yeah, and your point about James Dobson and the moral majority and and Pat Robertson.
Yes, James Dobson, yes.
They came after MacKay when he was in Congress, right? They had at some point Ocala had become, and Ocala's been very conservative since, but at some point in the 80s, Ocala really changed, and there was a Christian radio station in town. I remember Buddy MacKay telling me this story in the '98 campaign. The Pat Robertson or Jerry Falwell, or one of these characters, set up a radio station, and basically, like, all the talk show hosts on the local radio station, they were just going after your congressman. He's a baby killer, blah, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But MacKay still won in '86. So he had expressed to Childs that the people, the public, are not where you think they are on this issue. Because Childs, another thing that frustrated MacKay was Childs got sent a partial birth abortion bill once the Republicans took control in '97. He got sent both a partial birth abortion bill and a bill about was it a waiting period? I think it was a waiting period, and then during the waiting period, they have to the patients have to be given pamphlets, some such nonsense like that, right? About adoption and all of that. And MacKay, who's lieutenant governor, is like, Governor, you got to just veto these two bills. There's no ifs, ands, and buts. Childs decides he'll let one become law without his signature, and he vetoed the other. And I know another thing that MacKay was frustrated with Childs on was the school prayer issue. And just come out and unambiguously say you're against it if they send you a bill. And he never did. But then finally, when the bill did get to his desk a couple sessions later, he vetoed it. And the thought was, in the circles I ran in, Buddy got him to veto it. But that there were these things where Childs was much more comfortable, I think, with the old school conservative Democrat from North Florida, or from Polk County, from Imperial Polk County, where Lawton was from, right, from Lakeland. The Bob Crawfords, the Rick Danslers, the Curtis Petersons, Charles Kennedy Sr., whose son, of course, switched parties in the middle of Childs' administration, and is now, has become a very prominent Republican in the state, eventually Supreme Court justice. Buddy, despite having to tack to the middle politically, was always more comfortable with the activists. He was more comfortable with the environmental activists. He was more comfortable with the education activists. He was more comfortable, maybe not with the crazy, the far left anti-war activists, but he did vote against Contra Aid when he was in the U.S. House. But he was more comfortable with that activist community on the left. So it ended up being kind of a perfect partnership, but there was tension in it because Buddy's instincts were with those activists, as I said, and Lawton's instincts were, I don't want to piss off the people who dined at my Red Lobster. I don't want to piss off the people who go to the Governor's Club. I don't want to necessarily piss off associated industries of Florida. But what ended up happening, Ryan, is once Childs pushed the tobacco lawsuit, then I think the break, that when that happened, Childs was forced to the left, right? Because the left was what was still there for him at that point.
Oh yeah, no, the big tobacco case, absolutely. You see people kind of have to go back to their political home in these issues that are really transcendent. That was one where, hey, the MacKay wing kind of got a natural win just by because of the valence of its sort of polarity.
Yeah, that was the in 94, 95, and 96. Obviously, we had an election in 94 and we had an election in 96. But between 94 and 97, in terms of legislative politics, that was the issue. Because Governor Childs and Attorney General Butterworth had decided to sue the tobacco industry. This was kind of something that big business and the insurance industry was really irate about. And it also set up kind of the trial lawyer versus insurance company battles that the insurance companies ended up winning, which is why we pay what we do for homeowners insurance, among other things in this state. But that was the battle, and Lawton had to pick a lane, and he picked the liberal lane in that, and that was a MacKay wing win. And I think when the MacKay wing basically captured the Childs administration was that second term.
Along
it was from that tobacco
activist,
lawsuit onward.
An activist, four-term Attorney General Bob Butterworth there. That was kind of it. That 98 was when sort of all at once the liberal tradition, the progressive crusading reformist tradition that built a lot of buildings in state government, created a lot of public interest institutions, and sustained a lot of better than average governance in the South. And really, at times, we approached the most innovative and good faith, good government-oriented state government in the entire country at times, sort of all at once came to an end, didn't it?
Yeah, I think that's a great place to leave the conversation, Ryan, because then we'll just wrap up on this. Florida was, in terms of government accountability, government openness, transparency, and I would say just progressive governance at the very top nationally. By progressive, I'm not talking about today's progressive with whatever woke issue or whatever. I'm talking about, or even the sort of economic programs people like you and I advocate for. Progressive meant openness in government. It meant growing responsibly, growth management laws, which have since been gutted in this state. It's obscene, the growth in this state since the Democrats were ushered out of power in this state. That was very much a priority of Buddy MacKay. We're talking about good higher education, affordable higher education, well-funded public schools, the effort to attract top academics to our state university system. I don't know any top academic who wants to teach at a Florida school right now. And that was all part of the progressive tradition. And then, as I said, very, very proactive thinking about transportation also came out of the Graham and McKay-Chiles years. We were going to go with high-speed rail was a priority, building some sort of thing that at the time would have been very unique in this country. All of that was overturned by that 98 election. The ramifications of the 98 election and Buddy MacKay not getting to serve a full term as governor are something that we still live with today in the state.
Well, it's nice to reflect. I think lots of new green shoots for lots of future conversations. I look forward to digging into some of those on the History Podcast and elsewhere with you. Hey, 6 terms and 6 years in each branch of the legislature, 3 terms in Congress, and of course a month as governor, a full 8 years almost as lieutenant governor of Florida. Buddy MacKay, a special Floridian, a hugely important part of the consciousness of what makes Florida good during this great era, and a great Floridian. We certainly mourn him and celebrate his victories and wish him to rest in power.
Yeah, rest in peace, Governor MacKay. And Ryan, I would add one thing to that list you said. You laid out there beautifully, very eloquently. One night as senator-elect. We went to bed election night, 1988, thinking he was going to the U.S. Senate.
That's
so
right.
One night as senator-elect.
MacKay himself made strong parallels between 2000, and he kind of prefigured. He was sort of a sense the Al Gore of 1988, and then some of the time between. Really, really great. I love talking about this with you as always. Thanks for your expertise, and thanks for making time. Okay, and on our way out, shall we take a look at one more ad from the great Chiles MacKay period?
There's a new spirit of change and hope sweeping across Florida, a revolution in politics that's taking on the big money special interests, fighting for the people. Walken, Lawton, Chiles, and Buddy MacKay, honest, trusted, proven leaders, not beholden to the big money boys. Finally, a team that can really control growth, protect our environment, and improve our quality of life. The big developers and the SNL special interests have their candidates, but thank goodness the people have Chiles MacKay. Join the fight for positive change. Chiles MacKay, this time the people. There's a new spirit of change and hope sweeping across Florida, a revolution in politics that's taking on the big money special interests.